Welcome to Soft Contact. We hope this story helps you rest easy tonight, wherever you are. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is there, and what you think about this topic. Have you ever experienced anything similar to tonight's accounts? Tonight we're returning to the accounts of those who saw something unexplainable and then received visitors who should not have known to come. These are the follow-up stories, the deeper encounters, the ones that lasted longer and left more questions, memories stored in locked drawers, testimonies recorded and then hidden, letters written but never sent. Each one describes the same unnatural precision, the same impossible knowledge, the same quiet insistence that some things are better left unspoken. The men who arrive after you've crossed an invisible line, the ones who already know everything before you say a word. Chapter 1. The Week-Long Visit. I need to be clear about something from the start. When I say they visited me, I don't mean they came once and left. I mean they stayed. For an entire week, they were a presence in my life, appearing and disappearing with a casualness that suggested they could access my space whenever they wanted, that my home was as open to them as a public building. This was in 2004, and I'd been running a small UFO documentation website for about 3 years. Nothing sophisticated, just a place where people could submit their sighting reports anonymously, and I'd post them with basic categorization. I wasn't trying to prove anything or push any particular theory. I just provided a platform for people to share their experiences without judgment. The site had maybe 1,000 regular visitors, nothing that would draw significant attention, but I was meticulous about collecting data. I had spreadsheets tracking sighting locations, times, craft descriptions, witness demographics. I was looking for patterns, and I was finding them. Certain areas had clusters of activity. Certain times of year showed increased reports. There were consistencies in the descriptions that suggested people were seeing similar things across different locations and time periods. I'd compiled all this data into a report, nothing formal, just a document for my own reference. I kept it on my computer, password protected, never shared it with anyone. Looking back, I realized that was naive. If I could see the patterns, anyone with access to the same data could see them, and clearly someone was paying attention. The first time I saw him was on a Monday morning. I was getting ready for work, running late as usual when I came into my kitchen, and he was sitting at my table. Just sitting there, hands folded in front of him, wearing a black suit that looked like it had been pressed that morning. He was thin, pale, with dark hair slicked back so severely it looked painted on. His eyes were wrong, too dark, too steady, unblinking. I should have panicked, should have run, called the police, done anything except what I did, which was freeze in my doorway and stare. He smiled, a mechanical movement of his mouth that didn't reach his eyes, and said my name, not a question, a statement. Then he said, "We should talk about your website." I found myself sitting down across from him, even though I hadn't consciously decided to. He asked about the data I'd collected, the patterns I'd noticed, the conclusions I was drawing. His voice was soft, measured, every word precisely articulated. I answered his questions, and I don't know why. I didn't want to, but the words came anyway, like he was pulling them out of me. He never threatened me, never raised his voice, but he suggested very politely that the patterns I was seeing might be misleading, that publishing them might cause unnecessary concern, that perhaps it would be better if I focused my site on individual reports and avoided synthesis. He made it sound like friendly advice, but I understood it was not optional. The conversation lasted maybe 20 minutes. Then he stood, thanked me for my time, and told me he'd be checking in over the next few days to see how I was progressing with his suggestions. He walked to my front door, let himself out, and was gone. I sat at my kitchen table for another 10 minutes before I realized I'd never unlocked the door that morning. It had been locked from the inside, and he'd been sitting in my kitchen. I called in sick to work. I spent the day going through my house, checking windows, checking locks, trying to understand how he'd gotten in. Everything was secure. Nothing was disturbed. But my computer was on, and the document with my data analysis was open on the screen, even though I always shut down my computer at night. Someone had been through my files. That evening, he was back. I came out of the bathroom, and he was standing in my hallway. Same suit, same expression, same unsettling stillness. He asked if I'd thought about their conversation. I said yes. He asked if I'd made any decisions. I told him I was going to remove the analytical content from my site, keep only the raw reports. He nodded, said that was wise, and then he just stayed. Stood in my hallway, not moving, not speaking, just present. I asked him to leave. He said he would soon, but first he wanted to make sure I understood the importance of the changes I was making. We stood there in my hallway, me in my apartment, him between me and my living room, and I felt like a guest in my own home. Eventually, he moved, walked past me toward the door, and as he passed, I felt cold, like he was drawing heat from the air around him. He let himself out, and I immediately went to the door, locked it, put the chain on, dragged a chair over to wedge under the handle. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, watching the door, waiting for him to come back. He did, but not until Tuesday afternoon. I'd gone to work, tried to maintain some normalcy, and when I came home, he was sitting on my couch, reading one of my books. He looked up when I came in, smiled that mechanical smile, and asked how my day had been, like we were roommates, like he belonged there. This time I called the police. I told them someone had broken into my apartment and was refusing to leave. They said they'd send someone. The man in the suit listened to my call without concern, still sitting on my couch, still holding my book. When I hung up, he said the police wouldn't find anything wrong, that I might want to reconsider wasting their time. 2 officers arrived 15 minutes later. I explained the situation. Someone had broken in, was sitting on my couch. They looked at the couch. One of them asked me to describe the intruder. I pointed at the man in the suit and said, "Him, right there." Both officers looked where I was pointing, looked at each other, and one of them asked if I'd been drinking or taking any medications. The man in the suit was still there. I could see him clearly, sitting exactly where he'd been, but the officers couldn't, or they pretended they couldn't. They suggested I get some rest, recommended I speak to someone if I was experiencing stress or seeing things that weren't there. They left, and the man in the suit stayed on my couch. That's when I understood the depth of what was happening. He could be visible or invisible by choice. He could appear to me while remaining unseen to others. The implications of that were terrifying. He stayed in my apartment for the rest of the week. I'd find him in different rooms, sitting at my desk, standing by my window, once in my bedroom when I woke up at 3 a.m, just standing there in the darkness watching me sleep. He never touched anything, never moved my possessions, never ate or drank or used the bathroom. He was just present, a constant reminder that my space was not my own, that my privacy was an illusion. He spoke occasionally, always about the website, about the importance of being careful with information, about how sharing certain patterns could cause problems for people I'd never meet. He said it gently, like he was protecting me, but I heard the threat underneath. Stop analyzing, stop connecting dots, stop seeing patterns. Just host the individual reports and nothing more. By Thursday, I'd stopped trying to make him leave. I'd accepted his presence, moved around him like he was furniture. I ate meals with him sitting at my table. I watched television with him standing behind my couch. I went to bed knowing he might be in my apartment when I woke up. It became normalized, which I realize now was the point. They were training me to accept surveillance, to internalize the understanding that I was always being watched. On Friday evening, I made the changes to my website. I removed all analytical content, all pattern analysis, all attempts to synthesize the data into meaningful conclusions. I kept only the raw reports, no context, no connections drawn between them. When I finished, he was standing behind me, watching my screen. He said I'd made good choices. He said this was better for everyone. He said he wouldn't need to visit as frequently now, but he'd be checking in periodically to make sure I maintain these standards. Then he walked to my door, turned back, and said something I still think about constantly. He said, "You're not the first person we've helped understand boundaries, and you won't be the last. This is easier for everyone when we're all on the same page." Then he left, and this time I felt the difference. The atmosphere in my apartment changed. The pressure that had been present all week lifted. He was truly gone, not just temporarily absent. I collapsed on my couch and cried, not from relief exactly, but from the release of a week's worth of tension I'd been holding in my body. I kept the website running for another year, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. I posted the reports people sent, but I didn't look for patterns, didn't analyze, didn't try to understand what the data meant. Eventually, I shut it down completely, told the few regular contributors that I was moving on to other projects. But the real reason I shut it down was that I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, that my computer was compromised, my home was compromised, my privacy was gone. Every time I worked on the site, I felt like he might appear behind me, checking to make sure I was staying within the boundaries he'd established. I never saw him again after that Friday, but I've never felt alone in my apartment since. There's always the sense that someone could be watching, could be present in ways I can't detect. I bought new locks, installed a security system, even moved to a different apartment a year later. Nothing helped. The feeling persisted. That was 19 years ago. I don't run websites anymore. I don't collect data, don't look for patterns, don't try to understand the larger picture. I keep my head down, work a normal job, maintain a low profile, and I never ever talk about what I saw or what I learned before they decided I was seeing too much. Except I'm talking about it now, and part of me wonders if that will bring him back. If he's monitoring me somehow, if this account will flag me as someone who needs another visit, another week of having my space invaded, another lesson in boundaries and silence. But I'm older now, and I'm tired of carrying this alone. Someone needs to know that they don't just visit once. Sometimes they stay. Sometimes they make themselves comfortable in your life, in your space, in your head, until you accept their presence as inevitable, until you internalize the surveillance and the restrictions and the understanding that certain knowledge is not meant for you. That's how they work. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through persistent presence, through the slow erosion of your sense of safety and privacy until you voluntarily restrict yourself, until you become your own censor, until you don't need them to visit anymore because you've learned to stay within the lines they've drawn. If you're collecting data, looking for patterns, trying to understand the larger picture, be careful, be smart, keep backups they can't access, work in ways that don't leave digital footprints, and understand that if you see something significant, someone might notice that you've noticed. And if one morning you come into your kitchen and someone is sitting at your table, someone who shouldn't be there and couldn't have gotten in, remember that you have a choice. You can resist and endure what I endured, or you can acquiesce immediately, and maybe they'll leave sooner. Either way, understand that your life is about to change, that privacy and safety and autonomy are about to become conditional, and that the week or the day or the month they spend in your space will leave a mark that never fully fades, a sense of being watched that persists long after they're gone. I still look over my shoulder constantly. I still check my apartment carefully before I settle in for the evening. And I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with the absolute certainty that someone is standing in my bedroom watching me sleep, waiting to see if I've learned my lesson or if another visit is required. That's what they leave behind, not evidence, not proof, not anything you can show other people. Just fear and compliance and the permanent understanding that you are not in control of your own life if they decide otherwise. Chapter 2: The Office Building. I worked as a researcher for a small think tank in Washington, D.C., one of those organizations that produces policy papers and analysis that maybe a few hundred people read. We covered various topics: economics, foreign policy, emerging technologies. Nothing classified, all open source research, but we occasionally stumbled onto connections or patterns that hadn't been widely reported. In 2008, I was assigned to research unexplained aerial phenomena and their potential national security implications. This wasn't a fringe topic for us. There had been credible military reports, pilot testimonies, radar data that suggested something was operating in our airspace that we didn't fully understand. My job was to compile the available information, analyze it objectively, and produce a paper that policymakers could use to understand the scope and potential implications of the phenomenon. I spent 6 months on the research. I interviewed retired military personnel, reviewed declassified documents, analyzed patterns in sighting reports. What I found was consistent with what others had found. There was something real happening, something that displayed technological capabilities beyond our current understanding, and it had been happening for decades with minimal official acknowledgement or investigation. My paper was thorough, carefully sourced, and as objective as I could make it. I argued that regardless of what the phenomena were, foreign technology, domestic black projects, or something else entirely, they represented a potential security concern that warranted serious study. I submitted the paper to my supervisor, and she forwarded it up the chain for review and clearance before publication. 2 weeks later, I was called into a meeting, not in our office building, but in a conference room in a government building I'd never been to before. I assumed this was standard procedure for papers that touched on national security topics. I brought my notes, prepared to answer questions, defend my methodology, maybe revise sections that reviewers found problematic. When I arrived at the conference room, there were 3 men waiting. None of them introduced themselves by name. They wore dark suits, white shirts, conservative ties. They looked like government employees, but there was something off about them. Too coordinated, too similar. Like they'd been selected for similarity or trained to present a uniform appearance. They asked me to sit. They placed my paper on the table between us, and one of them said they'd reviewed it carefully and had some concerns. I expected questions about methodology or sources. Instead, they asked about my motivations. Why had I chosen to research this topic? What did I hope to accomplish? Did I have any personal experiences with unexplained phenomena? I answered honestly. The topic had been assigned to me. I hoped to provide policymakers with good information. I'd never personally experienced anything unexplained. My interest was purely professional. They listened without expression, taking no notes, making no comments. Then they asked about my sources. I explained that everything was documented in the paper: interviews, declassified documents, public reports. They asked if I'd spoken to anyone outside the formal interview process. I said no. They asked if I'd shared my findings with anyone before submission. I said no. Only my supervisor had seen the completed paper. One of them leaned forward and said they appreciated my thoroughness, but they had concerns about publication. He said the paper, while well researched, might cause unnecessary public alarm. He said it might interfere with ongoing classified programs. He said there were equities involved that I wasn't aware of, and publication could compromise sensitive operations. I asked what classified programs. He said he couldn't tell me. I asked what operations. He said that was also classified. I asked what specifically in my paper was problematic, thinking I could revise those sections. He said the entire premise was problematic, that treating unexplained phenomena as a legitimate security concern gave the topic unwarranted credibility. I pointed out that credible witnesses had reported these phenomena, that radar data existed, that military pilots had filed official reports. He nodded and said yes, all of that was true, but publishing an analysis that took those reports at face value would encourage more attention to a topic that was better left unexamined. I started to understand. They weren't concerned about accuracy or methodology. They were concerned about attention, about bringing analytical rigor to a topic they preferred to remain ambiguous and marginalized. The meeting lasted 2 hours. They went through my paper section by section, pointing out areas they wanted removed or revised. By the end, there was almost nothing left. Everything substantive, everything that made a case for serious investigation, was flagged for deletion. What remained was a thin summary of the topic that concluded nothing could be concluded, that more research was needed, but probably wasn't worth pursuing. I asked if I was being censored. One of them smiled, not warmly, and said no. I was being edited. He said this was standard review process for papers that touched on sensitive topics. He said I was free to publish whatever I wanted, but if I published content that had been flagged during review, there might be professional consequences. My security clearance might be reviewed. My employment might be affected. Nothing direct, nothing actionable, just difficulties that could emerge. I left that meeting understanding I had two choices: publish a gutted version of my paper that said nothing meaningful, or refuse and face professional consequences I couldn't fully predict. I chose the former. I made the revisions they requested, removed all substantive content, published a paper so bland and non-committal that it might as well not have existed. But that wasn't the end of it. After the paper published, I started noticing people around my office building. Men in dark suits, standing in the lobby, sitting in the coffee shop across the street, walking past on the sidewalk. They weren't always there, but often enough that I noticed. They never approached me, never spoke to me, just maintained a presence. My supervisor called me into her office and asked if I'd noticed anything unusual. I asked what she meant. She said someone had been asking questions about me, calling her, calling other staff members, asking about my work habits, my political views, my social connections. She'd reported it to building security, but they said there was nothing they could do unless someone made threats or attempted unauthorized access. I started varying my routine, took different routes to work, left at different times, stopped going to my regular lunch spots. The men in suits didn't follow me. At least I never saw them following me. But their presence around my building continued. It felt like monitoring, like they were checking to make sure I'd learned my lesson, that I wasn't pursuing the topic further. 3 months after my paper published, I found a note slipped under my apartment door. Not in an envelope, just a folded piece of paper. The note said, We appreciate your cooperation with the review process. We trust you'll continue to exercise good judgment in your research topic selection. That was it. No signature, no return address, no explicit threat. Just a reminder that they knew where I lived, that they were still paying attention, that my cooperation was expected to continue. I left the think tank 6 months later, told them I was pursuing other opportunities, which was true. I'd accepted a position at a university doing research that had nothing to do with national security, unexplained phenomena, or anything that might attract unwanted attention. I wanted to work in an environment where my research topics wouldn't result in anonymous meetings and men in suits monitoring my office building. But the experience changed how I think about information, about what we're allowed to know, what we're allowed to say, and what happens when we start connecting dots that someone prefers to remain unconnected. There are boundaries around certain topics, invisible lines that you don't know exist until you cross them. And once you cross them, people appear to explain the boundaries and encourage you to step back. Those people are polite and professional. They don't make explicit threats. They don't need to. The message is clear enough. Some topics are off limits. Some questions shouldn't be asked, and if you pursue them anyway, your professional and personal life will become complicated in ways that are difficult to prove or fight. I'm a professor now, teaching subjects that are far removed from unexplained phenomena and national security. I publish papers in academic journals, attend conferences, maintain a normal career, but I still sometimes see men in dark suits standing in places they shouldn't be, across from my university office, near my apartment building, in the audience at conferences I'm attending. They never approach, they never speak. They just maintain presence, a reminder that they're still watching, still monitoring, still making sure I stay within the boundaries they established years ago. I've thought about trying again, about doing the research they didn't want published, writing the paper that makes the case they didn't want made. But every time I seriously consider it, I remember that meeting in the government building, the systematic dismantling of my work, the men who appeared afterward to monitor and remind and intimidate through presence alone. And I think about the note slipped under my door, the implied threat wrapped in polite language, the understanding my cooperation wasn't requested, it was expected, and I stay within the boundaries. I choose safe topics. I avoid questions that might bring them back. That's what they count on. Not that they can stop everyone from asking questions, but that they can stop enough people, discourage enough researchers, create enough professional risk that most of us choose safety over truth. And it works. It's working right now. I'm a person who knows things, who's seen evidence, who could contribute to public understanding, and I choose silence because the cost of speaking is too high. Except I'm speaking now anonymously in a format they might not be monitoring, and maybe that's cowardice. Maybe I should attach my name and credentials and accept the consequences. But I've seen what those consequences look like, felt what it's like to be watched and monitored and reminded constantly that my autonomy is conditional. So I offer this account as a warning. If you're a researcher, a journalist, an analyst looking into topics that someone powerful prefers to remain obscure, understand what you're risking. Understand that publication isn't the end of the story, that review processes can gut your work, that professional consequences can emerge from nowhere, and that men in suits can appear to monitor and intimidate without ever making actionable threats. And understand that once they identify you as someone who asks the wrong questions, you never fully escape that designation. Years later, in a different career, in a different city, they'll still show up occasionally to remind you that they remember that you're still being watched that the boundaries they established still apply. That's the real censorship, not the dramatic seizure of documents or the explicit prohibition of speech. It's the slow, persistent application of pressure until you censor yourself, until you choose safe topics and avoid dangerous questions, until you become compliant not because you've been forced, but because you've calculated the cost and decided it's not worth paying. I made that calculation. I chose safety. And I've been living with that choice for 15 years, wondering occasionally if I should have been braver, should have published anyway, should have accepted the consequences in service of truth. But then I see them, standing across the street, sitting in the coffee shop, walking past my office, and I remember why I made the choice I made, and I stay quiet, and I keep my research within the boundaries they established, and I tell myself that survival and caution are not the same as cowardice, even if some days I'm not entirely sure that's true. Chapter 3, Fall. The Family Visit. My sister saw something in 1999 that she shouldn't have seen. A craft hovering over a field near our parents' house, low enough and close enough that there was no mistaking it for anything conventional. She was 16, walking home from a friend's house around 10 at night, and she stopped on the side of the road and watched it for maybe 5 minutes before it shot away at a speed that made her question what she'd witnessed. She told our parents. They were skeptical, but they listened. She told me. I was home from college for the summer, and I believed her because I knew my sister, and she wasn't prone to exaggeration or fantasy. She told 2 of her friends, tentatively, testing whether they'd mock her. They didn't. They were intrigued. And then, 3 days after her sighting, they came to our house. It was a Saturday afternoon. Our whole family was home. My parents, my sister, me, our younger brother. We were having lunch when there was a knock at the front door. Formal, measured, 3 precise knocks. My father answered and found 2 men on our porch, both wearing black suits despite the summer heat, both holding briefcases, both with expressions that were professional but somehow empty. They introduced themselves as investigators following up on a report about unusual activity in the area. They didn't specify what kind of investigators or what kind of unusual activity. They asked if they could come in to ask a few questions. My father, always cooperative with authority, invited them in. They sat in our living room, briefcases on their laps, and one of them asked if anyone in the household had seen anything unusual recently. My sister, sitting on the couch, tensed. She hadn't filed an official report. She'd only told family and 2 friends. There was no way these men should have known to come to our house. My father asked what they meant by unusual. The man said, lights in the sky, aircraft that didn't match conventional patterns, anything that seemed out of place. My mother said no, nothing like that. The man looked directly at my sister and asked if she was sure. My sister said yes, she was sure. He opened his briefcase and removed a photograph. He placed it on the coffee table. It was a picture of my sister, taken 3 nights earlier, standing on the side of the road looking up. The angle suggested it had been taken from a distance, possibly with a telephoto lens, and the timestamp in the corner matched the night of her sighting. My father demanded to know why they had a photograph of his daughter. The man said they'd been conducting surveillance in the area and had documented several people who'd stopped to observe unusual aerial activity. He said they were following up with witnesses to understand what had been seen and to provide context that might explain ordinary phenomena. My sister asked how they'd gotten our address. The other man spoke for the first time, his voice flat and measured. He said they had resources for identifying and locating witnesses. He made it sound routine, but the implication was clear. They could find anyone, anywhere, and they had capabilities beyond normal investigation. The first man asked my sister to describe what she'd seen. She did briefly, downplaying it, saying maybe it was just a plane or a helicopter. He nodded and said yes, there had been military exercises in the area that night, and what she'd seen was likely related to that. He said this with complete confidence, despite my sister clearly describing something that didn't match any military aircraft. Then he said something that changed the atmosphere in the room. He said it would be helpful if my sister didn't discuss her sighting with others, as it might lead to rumors or concern that were unwarranted. He said the military exercises were classified, and public discussion of them, even mistaken discussion, could create security issues. My father asked if my sister was in trouble. The man said no, not at all. They just wanted to make sure she understood that what she'd seen had a conventional explanation and didn't require further attention or discussion. My mother asked why they needed to photograph her. The man said it was standard procedure for identifying witnesses. He didn't apologize for the surveillance, didn't acknowledge it might be inappropriate, just stated it as fact. The meeting lasted maybe 20 minutes. Before they left, the second man handed my sister a card with a phone number on it. He said if she saw anything else unusual, she should call that number instead of discussing it publicly. Then they both stood, thanked us for our time, and left. My father immediately tried to call the number on the card. It rang once and disconnected. He tried again. Same result. He examined the card more closely and realized there was no name on it, no organization, no identifying information beyond the phone number, just a plain white card with 10 digits printed in black. We talked about what had just happened. My sister was shaken, upset that she'd been photographed without her knowledge, frightened by the implication that she was being watched. My parents were angry, but uncertain what to do about it. I was disturbed by the whole encounter, the way they'd found us, the photograph, the subtle threat wrapped in professional courtesy. My father called the police, described the encounter, said he was concerned about the surveillance of his teenage daughter. The police took a report, but said without names or badge numbers, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested it might have been federal agents following up on something legitimate, and if we weren't threatened, there wasn't a clear violation of law. But the visit didn't end there. Over the next several weeks, we all noticed things. Cars parked on our street that didn't belong to neighbors. Men in suits standing in public spaces near our house. The park, the grocery store parking lot, the library. They never approached us, never spoke to us, just maintained a visible presence. My sister's two friends, the ones she told about her sighting, both reported similar visits. Men in suits coming to their homes, asking questions, suggesting it would be better not to discuss what they might have heard. One of the girls' parents filed a formal complaint with the local police, but nothing came of it. The surveillance continued for about 2 months. Then gradually it faded. The cars stopped appearing. The men in suits were no longer visible in public spaces. Life returned to something like normal, except we all carried the understanding that we'd been monitored, warned, and reminded that our privacy was not absolute. My sister never reported another sighting. She saw things over the years. Most of us do if we pay attention to the sky. But she never mentioned them, never discussed them, kept them private. The experience had taught her that some things were better kept to yourself. Years later, after my sister was married with her own family, she told me she still sometimes saw them. Not often, maybe once a year. But she'd notice men in dark suits standing in places they shouldn't be. Near her workplace, across from her children's school, in the parking lot of her grocery store. They never approached, never acknowledged her, just maintained occasional presence as a reminder. She never called the number on the card, which she'd kept all these years. She showed it to me once, yellowed with age, the numbers still visible. She said she'd been tempted to call it dozens of times over the years, just to see what would happen, who would answer, what they would say, but she never did. The fear of reactivating their interest, of bringing them fully back into her life, was stronger than her curiosity. Our parents died without ever understanding what had happened. They accepted the explanation about military exercises, chose to believe the men had been legitimate federal agents doing legitimate follow-up. But my sister and I knew better. The photograph, the surveillance, the visits to her friends, the months of monitoring, none of that was standard procedure for following up on a misidentified aircraft. What my sister had seen was real, significant enough to trigger a response, and that response was designed to ensure her silence. Not through direct threat, but through demonstration of capability. They showed her they could find her, could photograph her, could access information about her family and friends, could maintain surveillance for as long as they deemed necessary. And the message was clear. Speak about this and we'll know. And next time, the response might be more severe. It worked. My sister carries a sighting from 1999 that she rarely discusses, and when she does, she frames it as probably just military aircraft, probably nothing extraordinary. She's internalized the narrative they wanted her to accept, not because she believes it, but because maintaining it is safer than challenging it. She's in her early 40s now, living a normal suburban life, raising kids who don't know their mother, once saw something that changed her understanding of reality. And once a year, sometimes more, she sees men in suits standing where they shouldn't be, and she knows they haven't forgotten that the file on her is still active somewhere, that she's still being checked on periodically to make sure she's maintaining her silence. That's what happens when you see something you shouldn't. It's not just you who pays the price. It's your family, your friends, anyone you've told. They become part of the file, part of the surveillance network, part of the system of monitoring and control that ensures silence through persistent low-level intimidation. My sister taught her children not to report unusual things, not to draw attention to observations that might be considered strange. She's passing down the lessons she learned. Some things are better left unacknowledged. Some sites are better kept private. Some truths are too dangerous to speak. And somewhere in a file cabinet or a database, there's a record of my sister's sighting, complete with photographs and surveillance notes and the assessment that she's been successfully managed, that she poses no further risk of public disclosure, that she's learned her lesson and can be monitored at reduced frequency while remaining flagged for immediate response if she ever changes her behavior. That's the system. That's how it works. And my family is just one of thousands, maybe millions, who've learned through direct experience that certain knowledge comes with costs, that certain sites trigger responses, and that silence is enforced not through dramatic confrontation, but through patient, persistent demonstration that you are never truly unwatched, that they can always find you, and that the price of speaking is higher than most people are willing to pay. Chapter 4. The Long Surveillance. I'm going to tell you about a form of monitoring that I think is more common than most people realize, but that rarely gets discussed because it's so gradual, so patient, that victims often don't recognize it as surveillance until years have passed. I had a UFO sighting in 2001. Nothing dramatic, lights in formation, performing maneuvers that conventional aircraft couldn't perform. I watched for maybe 10 minutes, tried to film it with a camcorder, but the quality was poor. I reported it to a UFO organization, submitted my footage, and moved on with my life. About a month later, I started noticing a car in my street that I didn't recognize. Dark sedan, always parked in the same spot about 3 houses down from mine. I'd see it when I left for work in the morning, see it when I came home in the evening. After about a week, I knocked on my neighbors' doors, asked if they knew who owned it. Nobody did. One neighbor said they'd assumed it was mine. The car disappeared after about 10 days. I thought nothing more of it. But 2 months later, it was back, or a similar car was back. Parked in a different spot, but still on my street. This pattern continued for years. A car would appear, stay for a week or two, disappear for a few months, then return. Always a dark sedan, always parked where it had a clear view of my house, never there long enough that I could justify calling the police about it. Around the same time, I started noticing people. A man in a dark suit standing at the bus stop near my office, even though I never saw him board a bus. A woman in conservative business attire sitting in the coffee shop I frequented, always alone, always watching the room rather than reading or working on a laptop. These sightings were sporadic enough that I couldn't be certain they were related, but frequent enough that I started to feel watched. The pattern was sophisticated. It never escalated to obvious harassment. Nobody approached me. Nobody made threats. Nobody even made direct eye contact. But the presence was constant enough to be noticeable, sporadic enough to be deniable. If I'd gone to the police and said I thought I was being followed, what would I have reported? A parked car that moved occasionally. People in public spaces who hadn't done anything wrong. This continued for 5 years. 5 years of low-level surveillance that I couldn't prove, couldn't report, couldn't do anything about, except notice and document privately. I kept a journal, noting dates and times when I saw the car or the watchers. The pattern was clear to me. They were checking on me regularly, maintaining awareness of my activities, but doing so carefully enough that I had no recourse. Then in 2006, the surveillance changed. I came home from work one day and found my apartment had been entered. Nothing was obviously disturbed, nothing was stolen, but I could tell someone had been there. Small things were moved. A book on my nightstand was in a slightly different position. My desk chair was pushed in when I always left it pulled out. The closet door I kept closed was slightly ajar. I called the police. They came, looked around, found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of theft. They took a report but said without anything missing or damaged, there wasn't much they could investigate. They suggested I might have forgotten the exact positions of things, that I should get better locks if I was concerned. But I knew. Someone had been through my apartment, and I was certain it was related to the years of surveillance I'd been experiencing. I installed a security system, changed my locks, bought cameras, but the feeling of violation persisted. My home was no longer safe. My privacy had been comprehensively breached. The apartment entry happened 3 more times over the next 2 years, always when I was at work, always leaving the same subtle signs that someone had been there but taking nothing, disturbing nothing in any obvious way. The security cameras never caught anyone entering or leaving. They'd been disabled somehow, or the footage had been erased. The new locks made no difference. I moved in 2008, didn't tell anyone my new address except my employer and my bank. Within a month, the surveillance resumed at the new location. The car appeared on my new street. The watchers showed up in public spaces near my new apartment. And yes, eventually, someone entered my new home as well, leaving the same subtle signs of intrusion. That's when I understood the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't about preventing me from speaking or suppressing information I possessed. This was about demonstration, about showing me that I could never escape their attention, that no precaution I took would be sufficient, that my life was permanently transparent to them. I stopped trying to evade the surveillance. I accepted it as a permanent condition of my existence. The car on my street, the watchers in public spaces, the occasional entries into my home, they became my normal, the background radiation of my life. I moved through my days knowing I was being observed, knowing my privacy was an illusion, knowing that resistance was futile because they had resources and commitment far beyond what I could counter. The psychological toll was significant. I became hypervigilant, constantly scanning my environment for watchers, constantly checking my apartment for signs of entry. I developed anxiety, depression, trust issues. My relationships suffered because I couldn't explain to partners why I was so paranoid, why I needed to check locks multiple times, why I sometimes saw people watching us and became agitated. I saw therapists. I tried medication. I tried meditation and mindfulness and every coping strategy available. Nothing addressed the root cause, that I was actually being surveilled, that my paranoia was justified, that the threat was real even if I couldn't prove it to anyone. In 2015, 14 years after my initial sighting, I finally had direct contact with my surveillance. I came home from work and found a man sitting in my living room, wearing the same dark suit I'd seen on the watchers over the years. He was calm, professional, completely at ease in my space. He said he wanted to have a conversation about my situation. I asked who he was. He said that wasn't important. I asked why I'd been under surveillance for 14 years. He said it was standard protocol for individuals who'd reported certain types of sightings, that the surveillance would continue indefinitely, and that I should view it as protection rather than persecution. I asked what I needed protection from. He said from my own poor judgment, from the temptation to seek publicity for my experience, from those who might exploit my story for purposes that could compromise national security. He said the surveillance was benevolent, meant to keep me safe and to ensure I didn't inadvertently cause problems. I told him it didn't feel benevolent. It felt like harassment, like intimidation, like a sustained campaign to destroy my peace of mind. He said he understood my perspective, but that I should consider the alternative. No surveillance would mean no protection, and there were entities interested in UFO witnesses who were far less benign than his organization. The conversation lasted about an hour. He never made explicit threats, but he made clear that the surveillance would continue, that I should accept it as permanent, and that any attempt to publicly discuss my situation or seek legal remedy would be viewed as poor judgment that might necessitate escalated response. After he left, I sat in my apartment for hours trying to process what had happened. 14 years of surveillance culminating in a visit that told me nothing would change, that this was my life now, that I should be grateful for their attention rather than resentful. That was 8 years ago. The surveillance continues. The car still appears on my street periodically. I still see watchers in public spaces. My home is still entered occasionally, though less frequently now. Maybe they've installed permanent monitoring and don't need physical access anymore. I don't know. I've stopped fighting it. I've accepted that this is my permanent reality, that the sighting I had in 2001 marked me in ways I didn't understand at the time, that the simple act of looking up and seeing something I wasn't supposed to see has defined the rest of my life. I'm 54 years old. I've spent more than 20 years under surveillance. More than a third of my life lived with the certain knowledge that I'm being watched, that my privacy is compromised, that people I can't identify have access to my home and information about my activities. The toll has been comprehensive. I never married. How do you bring someone into a life like this? I have few close friends because trust becomes impossible when you know you're being monitored. My career has been limited because I'm always afraid that advancement will bring more attention, that success will make me more interesting to my surveillance. I live small. I keep my head down. I maintain routine and avoid anything that might be construed as interesting or noteworthy. And I carry the weight of knowing that one sighting, one night of watching lights in the sky, has cost me a normal life, has sentenced me to permanent observation, has made me less than fully free in ways most people never have to consider. I'm telling this story because I think long-term surveillance is more common than people realize. Not everyone who reports a sighting gets visited dramatically by men in black suits. Some of us just get watched, quietly and persistently, for years or decades. The car on the street, the person in the coffee shop, the subtle signs that your home has been accessed, the slow accumulation of evidence that you're living under observation. If that's your experience, if you've noticed these patterns, know that you're not imagining it. Know that it's real, that it's deliberate, that it's a form of control and intimidation that works precisely because it's deniable, because it operates just below the threshold of actionable harassment, because it drives you slowly toward acceptance rather than forcing immediate compliance. And know that there are others of us living like this, scattered and isolated, carrying the same burden, experiencing the same surveillance, learning the same lessons about boundaries and submission and the cost of seeing things we weren't supposed to see. We're out here, living our constrained lives, watched and monitored and reminded constantly that we're not free, that our privacy is conditional, that the simple act of reporting what we saw has consequences that last lifetimes. That's the real suppression. Not the dramatic silencing, but the slow grinding erosion of liberty and peace of mind, continued until you voluntarily restrict yourself because the alternative, living with constant surveillance, is too psychologically costly to endure while fighting. They've won with me. I've accepted my surveillance, internalized it, built my life around it, and maybe that's what they wanted all along. Not to silence me through force, but to tame me through persistence until I became my own censor and their work became easier because I was doing it for them. Chapter 5. The Intercepted Communication. I worked in telecommunications for 15 years, specializing in satellite communications and data transmission. In 2012, I was working on a project involving error correction in satellite data streams when I noticed something unusual in the metadata of certain transmissions. The anomalies were subtle, timestamps that didn't quite align, packet sizes that varied in ways that shouldn't be random, routing information that suggested data was being copied or intercepted mid-transmission. As a professional, my job was to identify and fix these issues, so I documented them, traced their origins, and began to see a pattern. Certain types of data were being specifically targeted for what looked like interception, communications from military bases, data from research facilities, and interestingly, transmissions from certain civilian organizations, including several UFO research groups. The intercepts were sophisticated, nearly undetectable, and they were systematic. I reported this to my supervisor, framing it as a potential security issue. Our satellite network was being used for unauthorized surveillance. He listened, took my documentation, and said he'd forward it to the appropriate department. 2 days later, I was called into a meeting with company security and 2 men who identified themselves as federal contractors working on communication security. They asked me detailed questions about how I'd identified the anomalies, what analysis I'd performed, who I'd discussed my findings with. I answered honestly, thinking I was helping identify a security breach. Then one of them asked me if I understood the implications of what I'd discovered. I said yes, someone was intercepting satellite communications without authorization. He said no. I'd discovered authorized surveillance operating under classified programs, and by documenting and analyzing it, I'd accessed information I wasn't cleared for. He made it sound like I'd committed a violation rather than identified one. I protested that I'd simply been doing my job, that nothing in the satellite metadata should have been classified. He said the existence of certain surveillance programs was classified, and my documentation of their operational signatures was a classification violation, regardless of my intentions. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, I'd been read into classified information I didn't want to know, signed paperwork acknowledging my awareness of programs I couldn't discuss, and been warned that any further investigation or discussion of what I'd found would be treated as a security violation with criminal consequences. I went back to my regular work, but I'd been permanently changed by what I'd learned. The surveillance I'd identified wasn't rogue activity. It was official, systematic, and specifically targeted at UFO researchers and organizations. Someone was monitoring communications in this field comprehensively, and it was sanctioned at high levels. Within a week, I noticed I was being monitored. My work computer showed signs of access when I wasn't logged in. My personal email received messages that looked like phishing attempts, but were too sophisticated, clearly designed to test whether I was discussing what I'd learned. My phone developed odd behaviors, echoes on calls, battery draining faster than normal, unexplained data usage. I stopped using electronic communications for anything sensitive. I learned to assume all my devices were compromised. All my digital communications were monitored. The paranoia that had been theoretical became practical necessity. A month after the security meeting, I was approached by a man in a parking garage after work. He didn't threaten me, didn't even introduce himself. He just said he wanted to remind me about the paperwork I'd signed, about the consequences of discussing classified programs, and about how easy it would be for me to lose my security clearance and my career if I demonstrated poor judgment. Then he mentioned my family, my wife by name, my daughter's school, not threatening them, just acknowledging he knew who they were, where they were, what they did, making clear that the consequences of my actions wouldn't be limited to me professionally, that my family existed in his awareness and could be affected by my choices. I understood the message. I'd stumbled into knowledge I wasn't supposed to have, and now I was being managed, monitored, and reminded regularly that I needed to stay quiet, not just about what I'd discovered, but about the fact that I'd discovered anything at all. The surveillance of my communications continued for years. I'd get regular reminders that someone was paying attention, an email that referenced a private conversation I'd had, a phone call that mentioned something I'd only discussed at home, small demonstrations that my digital life was completely transparent to whoever was monitoring me. I left the telecommunications industry in 2017, took a job in an unrelated field, work that didn't involve classified information or government contracts, that didn't put me anywhere near the kind of data I'd been working with. But the monitoring continued. My new devices showed the same signs of compromise. My communications still felt observed. What I'd learned was that there's comprehensive surveillance of UFO research and researchers operated at high levels, sanctioned and systematic, and that anyone who discovers this surveillance, who documents it or tries to report it, becomes a target themselves, not for elimination, but for permanent monitoring and control. I can't discuss the specific programs I learned about. I signed documents that make doing so a federal crime. But I can say that if you're researching UFOs, if you're communicating with others in this field, if you're sharing information or analysis through any electronic means, assume it's being monitored. Assume your communications are being intercepted, analyzed, and stored, because they are. The infrastructure is in place. The programs are active. The surveillance is real. And anyone who discovers its existence becomes part of the system they discovered, marked for permanent observation, reminded regularly that they're being watched, that their knowledge is dangerous, and that speaking about what they know has consequences that extend beyond themselves to everyone they care about. I live with that knowledge. I've learned to accept that my communications aren't private, that my digital life is transparent to people I can't identify, that the work I did in 2012 marked me permanently as someone requiring monitoring. And I'm telling this now, carefully, aware that even this account is probably being flagged and analyzed, hoping that the value of the information outweighs the risk of sharing it, hoping that others who suspect they're being monitored can find some validation in my experience. The surveillance is real, the system is active, and once you see it, once you document it, once you understand how comprehensive it is, you become part of what you discovered. That's how it works. That's how it sustains itself, by transforming discoverers into the discovered, by making anyone who sees too much into someone who needs watching. Chapter 6, The Closing Understanding. I want to end these accounts with something I think is important for anyone reading them to understand. These aren't stories about isolated incidents or random encounters. These are descriptions of a system, coordinated, intentional, persistent, designed to control information about a specific topic through systematic monitoring and suppression of witnesses, researchers, and anyone who gets too close to patterns. Someone prefers to remain invisible. The methods vary. Some people get dramatic visits, men in suits appearing at their homes, conducting interrogations, making explicit warnings. Others experience long-term surveillance, years or decades of being watched, monitored, reminded constantly that they're not free from observation. Some face professional destruction, careers derailed, research suppressed, publications blocked. Some experience all of these things in combination, layered approaches that ensure compliance through multiple vectors of pressure. But the goal is always the same: silence. Not necessarily complete silence. That would be too obvious, too dramatic. But managed silence, controlled disclosure, making sure that witnesses and researchers stay within acceptable boundaries, that they don't assemble too much information in one place, that they don't make connections too explicitly, that they don't reach audiences large enough to shift public understanding. The system is effective because it's patient. It doesn't need immediate results. It can watch someone for 20 years applying gentle pressure, waiting for them to internalize the restrictions, to become their own censors. It can let researchers pursue their work right up until publication, and then step in to gut the content, destroy credibility, or simply make the costs of publication higher than most people are willing to pay. And it's effective because it operates in isolation. Each witness thinks their experience is unique. Each researcher thinks they're the only one being pressured. Each journalist thinks their obstacles are just bad luck or difficult sources. The pattern remains invisible because the individual experiences aren't aggregated, aren't analyzed collectively, aren't understood as components of a larger systematic effort. These accounts are my attempt to change that, to document experiences in enough detail that patterns become visible, to make clear that this isn't random, isn't coincidental, isn't just the unfortunate result of individual bad actors. This is systematic, coordinated, ongoing, and operating at a scale that suggests significant resources and high-level authorization. I'm someone who's experienced multiple aspects of this system. I've been visited, surveilled, warned, and monitored. I've seen how it operates from different angles, how it adapts to individual circumstances while maintaining consistency in goals and methods. And I've met enough others who've had similar experiences that I know this is widespread, that the accounts in these chapters represent a tiny fraction of the people who've been subjected to this system of control. We're out here, scattered and isolated by design, carrying experiences we can't fully share, living within restrictions we never consented to, accepting limitations on our freedom that most people never have to consider. We're the casualties of a system that prioritizes secrecy over truth, that uses intimidation and surveillance to maintain control over information, that treats witnesses and researchers as problems to be managed rather than people deserving respect and protection. Some of us have lost more than others, marriages destroyed, careers ruined, mental health damaged by years of surveillance and pressure. But we all carry the weight of knowing something we can't fully speak about, experiencing something we can't adequately prove, living under restrictions that are enforced through consequence rather than law. And we all ask the same questions. Why is this information so important to suppress? What truth is being protected by this elaborate system of monitoring and control? What could be so significant that it justifies decades of surveillance of ordinary people who happen to see something unusual? I don't have answers to those questions. The system doesn't provide answers. It just enforces compliance, maintains boundaries, and ensures that curiosity doesn't lead to understanding, that witnesses don't become advocates, that individual experiences don't aggregate into collective knowledge that might shift public understanding. But I know the system exists. I know it's real. I know it's operating right now, identifying new witnesses, monitoring researchers, suppressing information through methods that rarely leave evidence of censorship. And I know that the only way to counter it is through testimony, through documentation, through the slow accumulation of accounts that reveal the pattern despite efforts to keep it invisible. These accounts are part of that accumulation. These experiences join thousands of others, building a record that exists despite suppression, revealing a system that prefers to remain unseen. And maybe that's enough. Maybe testimony without proof still serves a purpose. Maybe patterns can be recognized even when individual instances can't be verified. Maybe the truth persists even when it can't be proven. I hope so, because if it doesn't, if testimony without proof is worthless, then those of us carrying these experiences are truly alone, truly without recourse, truly subject to a system we can't challenge or escape. But if testimony has value, if accumulated accounts reveal truth even without conventional evidence, then maybe our experiences matter. Maybe our stories contribute to understanding even when they can't provide proof. That's what I'm offering here. Not evidence, but testimony. Not proof, but witness. Not answers, but documentation of a system that operates in shadows, that maintains itself through pressure and persistence, that treats certain knowledge as too dangerous for public awareness. The men in black are real. The surveillance is real. The suppression is real. And if you've experienced any of this, the visits, the monitoring, the warnings, the consequences, know that you're not alone. Know that thousands of others have had similar experiences. Know that there's a pattern, a system, a coordinated effort to control information about a phenomenon that someone powerful believes should remain mysterious. And know that speaking about it, even anonymously, even without proof, is an act of resistance, a refusal to accept complete silence, a contribution to collective understanding that exists despite efforts to prevent it. These stories go forward, into the night, to be received by whoever needs to hear them, to validate experiences that are usually dismissed, to reveal patterns that are meant to stay hidden, to document a system that prefers to remain unseen. Sleep well wherever you are. The surveillance continues. The suppression persists. The system operates, but so do we. The witnesses, the survivors, the people who refuse complete silence even when we can't manage full disclosure. We're still here, still telling our stories, still insisting that our experiences matter even when we can't prove them. That persistence is its own form of resistance. That testimony is its own form of truth. And that might have to be enough for now, until conditions change enough that full disclosure becomes possible without the costs we've learned to fear. The stories will still be here when you wake. The patterns will still be visible to those who look. The truth will persist, however suppressed, however denied, however difficult to prove, and will still be here too, carrying our experiences forward, documenting what we can, speaking when we dare, bearing witness to a system that most people don't know exists, but that affects everyone who sees something they're not supposed to see, who asks questions they're not supposed to ask, who crosses invisible lines into territory marked dangerous not by law, but by consequence. That's what remains. That's what persists. And perhaps eventually, that accumulated testimony will matter more than it seems to matter now. Perhaps the patterns will become undeniable. Perhaps the system will fail. Until then, we keep telling our stories. We keep bearing witness. We keep insisting on the reality of our experiences, even when we can't prove them, even when speaking comes with costs, even when silence would be safer. Because the alternative, complete silence, total acquiescence, permanent submission, is a cost too high to pay, even for those of us who've already paid so much. The stories are told, the witnesses have spoken, the pattern is documented, however incompletely. And somewhere, someone reading this will recognize themselves, will understand they're not alone, will find courage or comfort or validation in knowing that others have experienced what they've experienced, survived what they're surviving, carried what they're carrying. And maybe that connection, that recognition, that understanding, maybe that's enough to make the telling worthwhile, despite the risks, despite the costs, despite the continued surveillance and suppression that telling these stories will likely trigger. We're still here, still witnessing, still speaking, still refusing the complete silence they prefer. And that, perhaps, is all the victory we can claim. But it's a victory nonetheless. The truth persists, the witnesses endure, and the stories continue, passed forward into whatever future waits, carrying with them the experiences of people who saw too much, knew too much, understood too much, and paid the price for crossing lines they didn't know existed until it was too late to step back. Rest easy. The night continues. The stories remain. And we're still here, in the darkness, telling truth as best we can, hoping it matters, knowing it costs, doing it anyway because silence is surrender, and we're not ready to surrender completely. Not yet. Not ever if we can help it. The stories will still be here when you wake. Chapter 7. The Photographer's Archive. I was a professional photographer specializing in night sky photography, landscapes under stars, aurora, meteor showers, that sort of work. I sold prints online, contributed to astronomy magazines, taught workshops. It was a good living, doing something I loved, and I was out under dark skies 4 or 5 nights a week, camera always ready. In 2009, I captured something I wasn't looking for. I was shooting a time-lapse sequence in the desert outside of Tucson, camera set up to capture star trails over a distinctive rock formation. I left it running for 3 hours while I worked on other compositions nearby. When I reviewed the footage later, I found that for approximately 40 seconds in the middle of the sequence, there were objects in the frame. Not stars, not planes, not satellites. These were structured craft, 3 of them, moving in formation across the sky. The time-lapse had captured them as streaks, but individual frames showed distinct shapes, triangular with lights at the corners, exactly the configuration that gets reported in UFO sightings. And because this was a time-lapse with precise timestamps, I could calculate their speed and altitude. They were moving at several thousand miles per hour at an altitude of maybe 30 to 40,000 feet. I was excited. This was exactly the kind of evidence that UFO researchers always said was needed: clear imagery from a professional camera with metadata intact, from a credible source with photographic expertise. I made backup copies of the files, stored them securely, and started thinking about how to release them in a way that would be taken seriously. I contacted a few UFO research organizations, sent them low-resolution samples, asked for advice on proper documentation and release. They were enthusiastic, wanted to see the full-resolution files, wanted to help me prepare for publication. I was careful. I didn't send the full files to anyone, didn't post anything online, kept everything secured until I could figure out the best approach. 2 weeks later, I had visitors, 3 men this time, all in dark suits, who arrived at my studio in the middle of the day. They didn't knock. I just looked up from my computer, and they were inside, standing between me and the door. One of them said my name and told me we needed to discuss some photographs I'd taken. I asked who they were. The one who'd spoken showed identification too briefly for me to read and said they were from a joint task force investigating airspace security incidents. He said my photographs documented classified aircraft during a training exercise, and that possession and distribution of such images violated federal law regarding classified information. I said I'd been on public land, photographing the sky, which was legal. He said the content of the photographs made them classified regardless of where they were taken or how they were obtained. He said ignorance of classification status wasn't a defense and that I needed to turn over all copies of the images immediately. I refused. I said they could get a warrant if they wanted my property. He smiled, not pleasantly, and said they could do that, and the warrant would allow them to seize all my photography equipment, all my computers, all my storage drives, and my business would be effectively destroyed while they sorted through everything. Or I could cooperate voluntarily, turn over just the specific images in question, and avoid that disruption. It wasn't really a choice. I had thousands of client files, years of work, my entire business stored on those drives. I couldn't afford to have everything seized, even temporarily. I gave them the drives with the time-lapse sequence. They took them and left, telling me that I should consider the matter closed and that any further discussion of classified aircraft would be viewed as a security violation, but I'd made backups before contacting the UFO organizations. Backups they didn't know about, stored off-site, encrypted. I'd lost the originals, but I still had copies of the most significant evidence I'd ever captured. Over the next few months, I tried to figure out what to do with those copies. I couldn't release them publicly. They'd know immediately where they came from, and I'd face the consequences they'd warned me about. I couldn't send them to researchers. Any communication might be monitored. I couldn't even keep them in a location connected to me without risk of discovery. During this time, I started noticing the surveillance. A car parked near my studio that didn't belong to nearby businesses, men in suits visible in public spaces I frequented. My website's traffic showed unusual patterns. Someone was systematically downloading my entire portfolio, probably analyzing every image I'd ever posted to see if I'd captured anything else of interest. My business started experiencing problems. Client contacts would reach out and then ghost me. Workshop registrations would be made and then canceled. Equipment orders would be delayed for unclear reasons. Nothing I could point to as obvious sabotage, just a steady accumulation of difficulties that made my work harder and less profitable. 6 months after the visit, someone broke into my studio. They didn't take equipment. My cameras and lenses, worth tens of thousands of dollars, were untouched. They took storage drives, including several that had been hidden in what I thought were secure locations. They knew where to look, what to take. It was surgical, professional, targeted. I reported it to the police, but I knew what had happened. They'd found my backups, or most of them. I still had one set, stored in a location I'd never accessed from any device connected to me. But I was afraid to retrieve it, afraid that going anywhere near it would reveal its location. My business never recovered from the compound effects of surveillance, interference, and the break-in. Clients lost confidence. Insurance rates increased. I couldn't shake the feeling that every shoot might be monitored, that any unusual images I captured would bring them back. I sold the studio in 2012 and took a job doing product photography for an e-commerce company. Safe, boring, completely divorced from night skies and anything that might be considered interesting. The backup drive is still out there in a storage unit I rented under a different name, paid for years in advance with cash. I've never retrieved it. I probably never will. The images exist. The evidence is real, but it's effectively buried. Too dangerous to access, too risky to release, lost to anyone who might be able to use it to advance public understanding. That's what happens to photographic evidence. It gets confiscated, or it gets buried, or the photographer gets pressured into silence. The images exist, I know because I've taken them, and I've talked to dozens of other photographers who've captured similar things. But they never see the light of day. They get seized by men in suits, or they sit in storage units unused, or they get posted online and immediately dismissed as fakes because real evidence is indistinguishable from manufactured evidence in the digital age. I think about those images sometimes. Clear, well-documented evidence of craft that shouldn't exist, captured by accident during a routine night shoot. Evidence that could have contributed to understanding, that could have been part of a larger body of proof that something real is happening in our skies. But it's locked away, buried, effectively destroyed by a system that's very good at identifying evidence and neutralizing it before it can reach audiences that matter. I'm not the only photographer this has happened to. I've met others at conferences, talked quietly in corners about the images we've captured and the visits we've received and the choices we've made to protect ourselves and our livelihoods. We're all carrying the same burden, evidence that can't be shared, knowledge that can't be spoken, proof that's been rendered useless by the threat of consequences. Some photographers have stopped shooting the night sky entirely. Others continue but don't review their images carefully, don't want to know if they've captured something problematic. I'm somewhere in between. I still photograph, but only commercial work now. Subjects that are completely mundane, nothing that could possibly attract unwanted attention. And I live with the knowledge that somewhere in a storage unit, there's a drive with images that matter, with evidence that's real, with proof that could contribute to understanding. But it might as well not exist, because I'll never retrieve it, never share it, Never allow it to serve the purpose that evidence is supposed to serve. That's the system's victory. Not seizing all the evidence, but making it too dangerous to use the evidence that remains. Making photographers like me complicit in the suppression, choosing to bury our own work because the alternative is too costly. Turning us into our own censors, our own suppressors, accomplices in keeping hidden what we ourselves discovered. I could retrieve that drive tomorrow. I could upload those images to 100 websites simultaneously, make them impossible to completely suppress. But I won't, because I've seen what happens to people who do that. I've seen careers destroyed, families disrupted, lives made small by persistent surveillance and consequence. And I've decided that my peace of mind, my safety, my ability to live a normal life, that's worth more than the contribution those images might make to public understanding. That's a cowardly calculation, maybe, but it's the calculation most of us make when faced with that choice. And the system counts on that, counts on our self-interest, our fear, our unwillingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of truth. And it works. It's working right now. I'm proof that it works. The evidence exists, but it remains hidden, not because they found it all, but because I'm too afraid to use what they didn't find. And that's the most effective suppression of all, the kind where the witness does the work themselves, where the photographer buries their own images, where the truth stays hidden, not because it was seized, but because it was voluntarily surrendered to fear. Chapter 8. The Support Group. In 2014, I tried to start a support group for people who'd experienced post-encounter surveillance and intimidation. I'd been through it myself, spent years dealing with the isolation and the psychological toll, and I thought maybe bringing people together would help, give us community, validation, shared strategies for coping with ongoing surveillance. I posted announcements in a few UFO forums, very carefully worded, describing the group as a space for people dealing with anxiety and isolation following unusual experiences. I didn't mention men in black or surveillance explicitly. I'd learned to be cautious with language, but people who'd been through it would understand what I was offering. I got responses, dozens of them. People who'd been visited, who were being watched, who were carrying the same burden I was carrying. We arranged a first meeting at a library in a suburb of Chicago, neutral ground, public space, somewhere that felt safe. 12 people showed up. We sat in a meeting room and went around the circle introducing ourselves, not with names, but with experiences. The woman to my left had been visited 3 times over 5 years after reporting a sighting. The man across from me had been under surveillance for a decade, had documented hundreds of instances of being followed and watched. The younger woman at the end had lost her job after men in suits spoke to her employer, suggesting she was mentally unstable. The stories were remarkably consistent, different details, different locations, different timelines, but the same core experience, seeing something, reporting it, and then being subjected to monitoring and intimidation that lasted years. The same men in dark suits, the same impossible knowledge about private information, the same subtle threats and demonstrations of capability. For 2 hours, we talked, shared, validated each other's experiences. It was profoundly healing. For the first time in years, I was around people who understood, who'd lived through similar things, who didn't question my sanity or suggest I was imagining patterns that weren't there. We weren't alone anymore. We had community. We scheduled a second meeting for 2 weeks later. Same location, same time. 10 of the 12 people confirmed they'd attend. We exchanged email addresses, carefully using secondary accounts. aware that our communications might be monitored, but willing to take that risk for the sake of community. 3 days before the second meeting, I received a phone call. Unknown number, a man's voice, calm and professional, said he wanted to speak with me about my recent activities. I asked who he was. He said that wasn't important. He said he understood I was organizing meetings of individuals who'd had certain experiences, and he wanted to advise me that such meetings were inadvisable. I asked why. He said that gathering people together to discuss experiences that might involve classified operations or national security matters could be construed as conspiracy to disclose classified information. I said we were just people sharing personal experiences. Nothing classified about that. He said the classification status of operations wasn't for us to determine, and that continuing to organize such meetings would be viewed as deliberate provocation. I told him I had a right to assemble, a right to free speech, a right to meet with whoever I wanted. He said of course I did. Those were important rights. But he wanted to make sure I understood the full implications of my actions. He said that people who'd attended the first meeting had been identified, that their participation had been documented, and that continued participation might affect their employment, their security clearances, their professional lives. I said he was threatening innocent people. He said no. He was simply explaining consequences, helping me understand that my efforts to help might actually harm the people I was trying to bring together. He said I should think carefully about whether organizing these meetings was really in anyone's best interest. The call ended. I immediately contacted the people who'd attended the first meeting, warned them about the call, asked if any of them had experienced problems. 6 of them reported visits or phone calls similar to mine. 3 had been contacted by employers about their mental health and reliability. 1 had been questioned by building security at his apartment complex about suspicious meetings he'd been attending. The second meeting didn't happen. People canceled, apologized, said they couldn't risk the attention. I understood. I wasn't angry at them for backing out. I was angry at the system that had identified us, monitored us, and applied just enough pressure to dismantle our attempt at community before it could really form. I tried once more, a year later, to organize a meeting. I was more careful this time, used fully anonymous communications, rented a private space rather than using a public library, told people to take precautions. 7 people confirmed they'd attend. The day of the meeting, I arrived at the rental space and found 2 men in suits standing outside. They didn't stop me from entering, didn't speak to me, just stood there. A clear message. We know where you are, we know what you're doing, we're watching. None of the 7 people showed up. I sat in the empty room for an hour and then left. I gave up after that. Clearly, any attempt to organize people who'd experienced this surveillance would be immediately identified and disrupted. The system was too good at monitoring, too quick to respond, too willing to apply pressure to individuals to prevent collective action. But I stayed in touch with some people. Through careful, encrypted communications, we shared strategies for coping with ongoing surveillance, warned each other when we noticed increased attention, provided the support we could in isolation since we couldn't meet in person. It wasn't the community I'd hoped to build, but it was something. A scattered network of people who understood each other's reality, even if we couldn't gather publicly. Over the years, I've learned that others have tried similar things. Support groups, research collectives, coordinated efforts to document the surveillance and intimidation that follows UFO encounters. All of them were disrupted. Some were infiltrated by people who seemed legitimate, but later revealed themselves as monitoring the group. Others were simply pressured into dissolution through visits and warnings. None lasted more than a few meetings. The system doesn't want us organizing, doesn't want witnesses comparing notes systematically, pooling resources, providing mutual support that might make individuals braver about speaking out. Isolation is part of the control mechanism. As long as we're scattered, alone, dealing with this individually, we remain manageable. Collective action is dangerous, so it's systematically prevented. I still communicate with about 15 people who I trust, who've been through similar experiences, who provide mutual support as best we can through monitored channels. We've learned to speak in code, to be careful about what we say even in encrypted communications, to assume that anything we share might be intercepted and analyzed. It's not the support group I wanted to create. It's not the community I'd hoped to build, but it's what the system allows, and we've learned to accept those limits while maintaining what connection we can within them. The isolation is part of the punishment, part of the control. They want each of us to think we're alone, to not realize how many others have had similar experiences, to not build the solidarity that might lead to collective resistance. And it works. It's working right now. We remain scattered, our attempts at community disrupted, our support systems limited to careful individual connections rather than organized group efforts. That's how the system maintains itself, not just through surveillance and intimidation of individuals, but through prevention of collective action, through disruption of any attempt to organize, through making sure that witnesses and researchers remain isolated and alone rather than unified and mutually supportive. And we let it happen because the cost of fighting it is too high, because every attempt to organize brings more attention, more pressure, more consequences for people who are already dealing with enough, because choosing isolation is safer than choosing community if community means increased surveillance and retaliation. So we remain alone or nearly alone, connected through tenuous digital links that might be monitored, providing what support we can while knowing that any attempt to formalize that support, to build real community, will be identified and destroyed before it can become effective. That's the reality we live in. That's the limitation we accept. And that's the system's victory, not eliminating us, but making sure we can never unite, never organize, never become more than scattered individuals carrying private burdens in public silence. Chapter 9. The Academic Conference. I was invited to present at an academic conference in 2016, a small interdisciplinary gathering focused on anomalous experiences and their social impacts. I was there as a sociologist, planning to present research on how extraordinary experiences affect witness credibility and social integration. Nothing controversial, just standard sociological analysis of a particular type of experience. My presentation was scheduled for the second day of the conference. I arrived the evening before, checked into my hotel, reviewed my materials. Everything was normal. I went to the opening reception, networked with other presenters, had the kind of casual academic conversations that happen at these events. The next morning, I came down to the conference venue and found two men waiting in the lobby. Dark suits, professional demeanor, that particular quality of stillness that I'd learned to recognize. One of them approached me and asked if I was presenting. Later that day, I said yes. He asked if we could speak privately. We went to a quiet corner of the lobby. He said they were aware of my research and had some concerns about the presentation I was planning to give. I asked how they knew what I was planning to present. He didn't answer directly, just said they'd reviewed my abstract and wanted to suggest some modifications to ensure I didn't inadvertently disclose sensitive information. I said my presentation was based on published research, all open source material, nothing classified. He said classification wasn't the issue. The issue was drawing attention to patterns that might reveal information about ongoing operations. He said my analysis, while academically sound, connected dots in ways that could be problematic from a security perspective. I asked what specific content was problematic. He pulled out a printed copy of my presentation slides, slides that existed only on my laptop and a thumb drive in my hotel room. He'd somehow obtained my complete presentation materials. He went through slide by slide, pointing out sections he wanted removed or modified. By the end, he'd essentially gutted my presentation. Everything connecting witness accounts to systematic patterns of post-encounter intimidation was flagged for removal. Everything suggesting coordinated surveillance of UFO witnesses was deemed problematic. What remained was so general and nonspecific that it barely constituted a coherent argument. I told him I wasn't going to present a watered-down version of my research. He said that was my choice, but he wanted me to understand the consequences. He said academic careers were fragile things, dependent on reputation and collegial relationships. He said presenters who made poor judgment calls at conferences could find future invitations drying up, publication opportunities disappearing, tenure decisions going against them. He wasn't making explicit threats. He was explaining how things worked, how my decisions here might affect my professional future. But the message was clear: present as planned and face professional consequences, or modify the presentation and maintain my career trajectory. I had 2 hours before my presentation slot. I spent them in my hotel room, staring at my slides, trying to decide what to do. I thought about refusing, presenting my original research regardless of consequences, but I also thought about my students, my colleagues, the research program I'd built over years. One presentation wasn't worth destroying all of that. I modified the presentation, removed the controversial sections, made it safer, vaguer, less threatening to whoever was monitoring my work. When I gave the presentation, it was academically competent, but intellectually dishonest. I'd self-censored, compromised my research, presented a version of truth that was acceptable rather than accurate. The audience seemed satisfied. They didn't know what I'd removed, what connections I'd avoided making. My fellow presenters complimented me afterward. From their perspective, it was a successful presentation. Only I knew what I'd surrendered, what truth I'd withheld, what compromise I'd made to protect my career. But the incident didn't end with the presentation. Over the following months, I noticed I was being frozen out of academic networks related to anomalous phenomena. Invitations to conferences stopped coming. Journal editors who'd previously been interested in my work started rejecting submissions without sending them for review. Colleagues began avoiding me or treating me with unusual wariness. I eventually learned through an informal conversation that I'd been flagged as problematic in certain circles, that my research was considered sensitive, that institutions were being advised to limit my involvement in anomalous phenomena research. It was informal blacklisting, nothing official, but effective enough to essentially end that line of my academic work. I shifted my research focus to completely different topics: social media behavior, urban sociology, safe subjects that wouldn't attract attention from men in suits. I rebuilt my academic career on foundations that had nothing to do with the work I'd been most passionate about, and I learned to keep my mouth shut about what I knew, what I'd experienced, what I'd been forced to compromise. The academic world talks a lot about freedom of inquiry, about pursuing truth wherever it leads, about the importance of uncomfortable questions. But there are limits to that freedom. boundaries around certain topics, consequences for researchers who stray into areas that someone has decided are too sensitive for legitimate academic study. Those boundaries aren't enforced through official policy. There's no list of forbidden topics, no explicit censorship. It's all done informally. Conferences that stop inviting certain researchers, journals that reject certain submissions, informal warnings that spread through professional networks, soft suppression, deniable pressure, career consequences that seem unrelated but follow clear patterns for anyone who looks closely. I'm still in academia, still teaching and publishing, but I'm not studying what I want to study, not asking the questions I want to ask, not contributing to understanding in the areas I think are most important. I'm working within the boundaries that were established for me that day in a hotel lobby when two men in suits showed me my own presentation slides and explained what I needed to remove to protect my career. That compromise eats at me. I tell myself I made the practical choice, that I couldn't sacrifice everything for one presentation, that I can still do good work in other areas. But I know I surrendered something important that day. I know I let fear dictate my choices. I know I became complicit in the suppression of knowledge I'd worked years to develop, and I know I'm not alone. I've talked quietly with other academics who've had similar experiences, research suppressed, careers threatened, boundaries explained politely but firmly. We recognize each other at conferences, exchange knowing looks, have careful conversations in quiet corners about the topics we can't study and the questions we can't ask. The academic study of UFO phenomena remains marginalized, not because there's no serious research being done, but because serious researchers who try to do it face consequences that make continuing impossible. The system doesn't need to prevent all research. It just needs to make sure the research that gets done stays within acceptable limits, that dangerous connections don't get made publicly, that patterns remain obscure and analysis remains fragmentary. And it works. It worked on me. I'm living proof that it works. I had research worth presenting, analysis worth sharing, and I chose career safety over intellectual honesty. I made the compromise they knew I'd make, chose the path they knew I'd choose, and in doing so, I became part of the system that suppresses the very knowledge I dedicated years to developing. That's the real victory of their approach, not stopping all research, but compromising researchers, turning us into our own censors, making us complicit in the suppression, making us choose between truth and career, knowing that most of us will choose career, that most of us will make the compromises they need us to make. I made that choice. I'm living with it. And I'm telling this story so others will understand what they're risking when they pursue research in this area, what pressures they'll face, what compromises they'll be asked to make, so they can decide with eyes open whether the pursuit of truth is worth the professional costs, whether they're willing to sacrifice career for knowledge, whether they're braver than I was when faced with that choice. Because someone needs to be braver. Someone needs to choose truth over safety, research over career, disclosure over compromise. I wasn't that person. Maybe someone reading this will be. Maybe someone will make the choice I couldn't make, will present the research despite consequences, will refuse the compromises and accept the costs. I hope so. Because if we all make the choices I made, if every researcher compromises when pressured, if the system's approach continues to work as effectively as it worked on me, then certain truths will remain forever obscure. Certain knowledge will never reach public awareness, and the suppression will continue indefinitely through the complicity of the people who could challenge it but choose safety instead. Chapter 10: The Final Testimony. I'm going to end with something different from the other accounts. Not a specific incident, but a reflection on what decades of carrying this knowledge does to a person, how it shapes your life in ways both obvious and subtle, how it changes your relationship to truth and reality and your place in the world. I had my first encounter in 1995. I've been visited, monitored, warned, and managed for nearly 30 years. That's more than half my adult life lived under surveillance, more than half my existence shaped by the knowledge that I saw something I wasn't supposed to see and that I've been paying the price ever since. The practical impacts are significant. Careers limited because certain jobs require security clearances. I can't get or involve positions where background checks reveal my history of UFO reports and post encounter visits. Relationships damaged because it's hard to maintain intimacy with someone when you can't explain why you check your apartment obsessively, why you vary your routes constantly, why you sometimes see people watching and become anxious in ways that seem irrational to them. But the deeper impact is psychological. Living for 30 years knowing you're being watched changes how you think, how you perceive reality, how you understand your place in the world. You become hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats that are real but unprovable. You learn to trust no one completely because trust requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires safety. And you're never safe when you're under permanent surveillance. You also become isolated in a particular way. Not just socially isolated, though that happens too, but epistemologically isolated, separated from consensus reality by knowledge that most people don't share and won't believe if you tell them. You know things about how the world works that contradict official narratives, that reveal mechanisms of control most people don't experience directly, that demonstrate the limits of freedom in ways most citizens never encounter. That knowledge is lonely. It's powerful in its way. It lets you see things others miss, understand patterns others don't recognize. But it's also alienating, separating you from people who live in a world where privacy is assumed, where seeing something unusual is just an interesting story rather than an invitation to permanent monitoring, where speaking truth doesn't come with consequences that last decades. I've tried over the years to find meaning in this experience, to tell myself that I'm learning something important, that my perspective is valuable, that 30 years of surveillance has given me insights worth having. Sometimes I believe that. Sometimes I think I see things more clearly than people who've never had their assumptions about freedom and privacy and safety challenged by direct experience of how easily those things can be taken away. But other times I just feel tired, tired of being watched, tired of self-censoring, tired of the constant low-level anxiety that comes from knowing I'm living a monitored life. Tired of choosing every word carefully, of avoiding topics that might bring increased attention, of maintaining the compromises I've made to maintain what limited peace I have. I'm 62 years old. I've spent 30 years, my 40s, my 50s, my early 60s, under surveillance. That's supposed to be the time when people consolidate their careers, raise families, build the lives they'll live for their remaining decades. I've done all those things, but always with the weight of being watched, always within the constraints imposed by my status as someone requiring permanent monitoring. And I don't know when it ends. Does surveillance continue until I die? Do they have a file on me that will be closed only when I'm gone? Or does it eventually fade? Do they eventually decide I'm too old to be a concern, no longer capable of causing problems, safe to be ignored? I don't know. Nobody tells you the terms of your sentence when you're marked for permanent observation. What I do know is that I'm tired of carrying this alone, tired of the isolation, the constraints, the permanent awareness that I'm being watched, and that's why I'm contributing to these accounts, adding my voice to others who've experienced similar things, trying to build a record that might help others understand they're not alone, that might reveal patterns that are supposed to stay invisible. I don't expect these accounts to change anything. The system is too entrenched, too effective, too willing to wait generations if necessary while maintaining just enough pressure to ensure compliance. But I can offer testimony. I can document my experience. I can say clearly and publicly, even if anonymously, this happened to me, this is happening to others. The surveillance is real and the suppression is systematic, and the costs are higher than anyone who hasn't lived through it can really understand. Maybe that's enough. Maybe bearing witness, even without the power to change what I'm witnessing, serves some purpose. Maybe the accumulation of accounts like mine will eventually reach some critical mass where they can't be ignored or dismissed. Maybe not in my lifetime, but eventually, or maybe not. Maybe the system is permanent. Maybe the suppression is unbreakable. Maybe those of us carrying these experiences will carry them to our graves without ever seeing acknowledgement or justice or even basic understanding from the broader world. I don't know which future we're heading toward. I only know that I'm tired, that I've carried this for 30 years, that I'll probably carry it until I die, and that before that happens, I want to leave some record, some testimony, some accounting of what this life has been like. For anyone reading this who's experiencing something similar, you're not alone. The surveillance is real. The suppression is systematic. The costs are significant and lasting. And there are more of us than you think, scattered and isolated, carrying similar burdens, living similarly constrained lives. We're out here. We recognize each other sometimes across distances through the patterns of our experiences. We share what support we can, given the limitations of monitored communications and enforced isolation. We bear witness to each other's experiences, validate each other's reality, remind each other that we're not imagining this, we're not crazy. This is real, even though we can't prove it in ways that satisfy people who haven't experienced it themselves. That's all I have to offer. My testimony, my experience, my 30 years of living under surveillance as consequence for seeing something I wasn't supposed to see. It's not much. It won't change the system. It won't stop the monitoring or prevent future witnesses from experiencing what I've experienced, but it's truth as I've lived it. And in a world where truth about this topic is systematically suppressed, even limited truth shared carefully might matter, might help someone feel less alone, might contribute to understanding, however incompletely. So I offer it forward, into the darkness, to whoever needs to hear it, to whoever is living through something similar and needs to know they're not the only one, to whoever comes after, whenever conditions allow this testimony to be received and understood and maybe even acted upon. The surveillance continues, the suppression persists, the costs accumulate. But so does the testimony, the witness, the accumulated record of people saying clearly, this happened to us, this is real, this matters even when we can't prove it, even when speaking about it comes with costs, even when the world isn't ready to hear what we're saying. We're still here, still watching, still witnessing, still refusing complete silence, even when we can't manage full disclosure, still insisting that our experiences matter, that truth matters, that the slow accumulation of testimony might eventually shift understanding even when individual accounts can't. That persistence is what I have left, that refusal to be completely silent, that small resistance against a system designed to ensure our compliance. It's not much, but after 30 years of surveillance, of compromise, of living within constraints I never consented to, it's all I have to offer. My voice added to others, saying clearly, even if anonymously, We're here. We've experienced this. It matters even if we can't prove it. And we won't be completely silent, even though silence would be easier. The stories will still be here when you wake. The testimony continues. The truth persists, however suppressed, however costly to speak, however difficult to hear. And we persist too. The witnesses, the survivors, the people who saw something, paid the price, and still refused to pretend it didn't happen. That's what remains. That's all I can give, and perhaps eventually it will be enough.